So here you see I am demolding the blanks and I make all my own molds. They're manufactured out of HDPE. That way I can both reuse them and I can make custom sizes. One other advantage that I have found is I don't need to worry about mold release. It won't rip like silicone. There's just with the hard plastic, there's just some advantages you can't get with soft silicone molds. And I know it's a little more to pry them out, but custom size, durable. I mean, these things will last forever, so you can't really beat them. I'm starting out with just chucking them on the outside as they are. The squares fit into one of the chucks I have. I've got a pretty good variety, and what I'm going to do is what I consider the most efficient for my process. All I'm doing is I'm going to take the center out for the initial size to work from and then size it up from there. And there's a number of ways you can do it. You could use a hole saw, and I do have a drill press, so I've done it that way, but it gets kind of dangerous in a way because you got to hold on to that while you're putting a giant drill bit through, and I don't really like to do that simply because it gets very grabby with hole saws. So here I'm just going to mark it out, and that's the approximate size I want to start at. And I am looking at making a 58 millimeter hole in the end. So I'll just undersize it and then expand it to what I need from there. The tool I've chosen to use is a thin parting tool to get it started, but then I am going to go with a different parting tool that has a lower profile. It's a little wider, but it's also easier to get into the smaller diameter. Once you start getting in a little bit of depth, then it wants to start grabbing because that initial thin parting tool is just too tall and it forces you to make a really wide path, or you're going to start grabbing the sides and it's going to get dangerous. Here you're going to see me punch through, and I'm going to save that core because it makes a nice ring blank, and that way I'm also not throwing away good material. So now I'm measuring it just to see where I'm at and about how much I want to take out, and I'm just going to slowly work my way and keep in mind that I'm trying to keep a parallel inside edge. So once I get done, I'm going to check the wall and make sure that it is parallel and then put a slight round to it. I'm using these calipers so that I can see when I go through if it's uneven from one side to the other. There I'm double checking that I'm at the size that I want, or if I need to take more material off. And as you can see, I'm going back at it and trying to get a little bit more material out because I am going to try and get as close to 58 millimeters as possible, but by hand, you're going to have some variance, and that's just the nature of it. And you're just going to see me repeating the measurements and then going back and refining, and it's just a slow process. You take your time, and eventually you reach where you want to be. You verify everything's squared up, and then you can start the finishing process. This will be my final check. I'm at the diameter I wanted, and now I'm just going to take it out and we're on to the next blank. For the second blank, I decided to eliminate the thin parting tool at 1/16 and just go with a 1/8 parting tool right out of the gate. This was just easier. It's less risk of getting grabby and catching, and it's still going to give me the same result in the end because I'm going to have to switch no matter what with the shorter profile. So started out that way, ran it right through, and then you'll see me pull the plug out later. And here you're going to see me just repeating the same process. So I'm going to open up the hole and work towards the diameter that I want, trying to keep the walls parallel and get the diameter all at the same time. It's just using basically a box scraper, and this is a 3/4 inch box scraper that all I'm doing is sharpening up the edge, getting a burr, and then slowly working back and forth until I get that diameter open. Check it with the calipers for the equal wall thickness, and then back to adjustments. And once I reach the diameter, then I'll pull this blank out as well. So I wasn't sure which jaws I wanted to use for holding it on the inside diameter, so all I'm doing is taking my skew and using it like a negative rake scraper on its side and trying to get a flat reference surface, because depending on which chuck, you either need that flat reference surface to keep it squared up, but later on you'll see I decided to go with shark jaws, and they are just easier in my opinion for setting up to do the outside by getting total access to it without having to worry about running into your chuck later if you're squared up on that flat edge. So now I'm changing out my chuck, and I have decided at this point to go with shark jaws. These shark jaws are actually start at 2 1/8 inch, so they're going to work perfectly. They won't have to expand far, and I'll get a nice grip. And the other thing I appreciate about these shark jaws is with the serrations, I use that to line up, and it's not perfect, but it still gets a good index and gets me to a point where I feel I can get a decent squareness to it so that I can just come back and clean up the outside edges as necessary to have a uniform width. So we're going to just take this down to round. I'm starting to work off the corners, and you're going to just start seeing me forming the overall shape on the outside diameter. And the diameter, depending on what material you're using, can be as thick or as thin for the wall as you want. Obviously, you don't want to have a big chunky thing that's something like an inch thick, but you can go substantial. I mean, 3/8 of an inch is reasonable, and you can go down if you want to get really challenge your skills and materials. You could go down to 1/4 inch or even 3/16, and once you start getting past 3/16, I find it just makes the material too weak. The one good thing that I've done with this blank is I have resin that's cast with Burl, so it actually has resin around the entire circumference, and that's going to help keep strength so that I don't have to rely on the wood grain to be strong enough to hold it together. One thing that I find is you'll see I'm using a 3/8 bowl gouge, And a lot of people really aren't comfortable using traditional gouges with resin, but I find if you refine your technique a little bit, just don't put a lot of force into it, you keep a sharp edge, use different approaches, listen to what the piece is telling you, you can use a traditional tool and you do not have to go to carbide. You will have to sharpen more, but I save the expense of having to buy carbides by just using the tools I have on hand, and I don't need quite as many tool changes. So there's some pros and cons to it, but I find overall I just don't feel the need to always use a carbide just because material's resin. Now that the bulk has been removed, I am changing my tools out and I'm using negative rake scrapers. One is a round nose for the side and bringing in a nice chamfer. The other one's a square end with just a slight radius, and that way I can glide back and forth. And the negative rakes are really good at just shaving material off without leaving a harsh finish. It doesn't chip it out. It works really good on the refinement phases until you get to where you want to be. So I'm just going to do a quick double check, make sure that the diameter is good, flip it, and now I am going to show a trick that I use to square up the edge, and that's my reference point. And it's similar to what I was talking about earlier, where if you have that reference square edge, you can use that so that you get the even wall or the even width on the bracelet in the end. It's just a different way of going about it, but gives you the same result. And I'm just refining slightly, getting a rounded corner so that it feels good when you're trying to slide it on and off. Obviously, you don't want any sharp edges. So this is just going to make it a little bit more comfortable to wear, and it's going to make it easier to get on and off. Here I'm just doing a few final checks and a couple adjustments, and once these are done, then it'll be ready to sand the inside while I still have access. And we're finally ready for sanding, so I'm just going to hit the inside diameter and those chamfers real quick. And I start out, depending on the finish, it could be 180, and if it's really not a good finish, then I will go down to 120, but I like to stay up with the resin because the 120 leaves some pretty deep scratches and they're hard and you got to work them out. So I eventually worked my way up to 600 grit using mesh at 4 and 600 because it just helps keep the sandpaper clean. But up to about 320, I just use conventional sandpaper. Does the job fine. I try to make sure it doesn't clog up and stays clean. Just keep working at it. And as you can see, I'm doing across. I'm not just doing radial. That way I get those deep scratches are gone. And then I move on to the next grit. I have found too that once you hit 600 grit, you're generally pretty good to go. Sometimes I'll use a white Scotch Brite to finish up and just kind of blend out the last of those little scratches from any of the 600 grit. But over the years, I have found that if you use a good abrasive paste, that after 600 you can get a nice finish without having to work through and go through wet sanding and ending up at like 1200 or using micro mesh. It's just not necessary, and it's a lot of extra wasted time, and really nobody likes sanding. So I just work at it, make sure I sand through the grits correctly before I finish up at 600, and then use a nice abrasive paste finish, and I am done at that point. At this point, I'm just going to repeat all the same steps. I'll do the outside of this one, and then I'll switch blanks, and I'll do the inside and outside of the other blank. So that being said, I'm going to stop talking and let you enjoy some music while we go through the rest of the stages of finishing this up.